It all began with a simple dream, a piece of land transformed into something more than just soil and grass. For years, the small patch of backyard behind my house had been nothing more than a rectangle of neglected earth, overrun by weeds and forgotten by every owner who had come before me. But when I moved in, it became the place where I poured my energy, my patience, and my love for life. It started small, just a couple of wooden planter boxes filled with herbs and a few tomato vines leaning awkwardly against their stakes. But soon, it grew into something remarkable. Rows of fresh vegetables, sprawling strawberry plants, and sunflowers stretching proudly toward the sky painted. The once dull yard with colors of abundance, the garden became my sanctuary. In the evenings after long workdays, I would slip into the yard, feel the cool dirt between my fingers, and lose myself in the rhythm of nurturing life. It wasn't just food, it was therapy. The lettuce and cucumbers became crisp reminders of my hard work, while the zucchini harvests often left me with so much produce that I shared baskets with neighbors. Some of them appreciated the kindness. Others, not so much. At first, the neighborhood seemed perfect. It was quiet, clean, and structured in the way that only HOA-controlled neighborhoods can be. Streets lined with nearly identical houses, lawns trimmed to the same height, mailboxes matching down to the paint color. But beneath the carefully crafted image of perfection, there was a tension simmering, a sense that conformity wasn't just encouraged here, it was demanded. And anyone who dared to be different would quickly learn what rules meant in this community. My garden, despite being entirely contained within my fenced backyard, caught the wrong kind of attention. One morning, I found an envelope slipped into my mailbox. It bore the official letterhead of the Homeowners Association, crisp and cold. Inside was a notice of violation. The wording was sharp, impersonal, and almost mocking. It claimed that my garden was not in compliance with community aesthetics, and that vegetation exceeding permitted use must be removed within 10 days. I stood there on my porch with the letter in hand, stunned. My garden wasn't a jungle, nor was it visible from the street. It was behind my house, shielded by a 6-foot fence, a space that should have been mine to enjoy without interference. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it had to be a mistake. Surely the HOA wouldn't care about what I grew in my own yard, especially when it wasn't disturbing anyone. But I underestimated just how far they were willing to go. Over the following weeks, more letters appeared. Some demanded that I restore the backyard to a lawn consistent with community standards. Others threatened fines that would accumulate daily until compliance was achieved. The escalation felt deliberate, almost personal, as if someone on the board had made it their mission to target me. I began noticing strange things. Cars parked near my house with board members sitting inside, clipboards in their hands as if they were surveying my backyard. A drone hovered above one evening, its buzzing mechanical wings cutting across the sky before darting away. Even my trash cans were rifled through once, leaving scraps scattered across the curb like a warning. The peaceful retreat I had built was no longer just a garden. It was the center of a war one never asked for. Still, I held my ground. Every time I walked between the rows of peppers and beans, every time I pulled a ripe tomato from its vine, I reminded myself that this was my home, my land, and no one had the right to dictate how I lived behind closed fences. But the HOA saw it differently. They saw my resistance not as a homeowner protecting his space, but as defiance, a challenge to their authority. And authority was something they intended to defend at all costs. The fine started small, $25 here, $50 there. But as I refused to comply, they multiplied. One morning, I logged into my account only to find that I allegedly owed the HOA over $1,000 in violation penalties. They weren't just trying to control me, they were trying to break me. Each envelope in my mailbox became a weapon, each fee an attempt to wear me down until I surrendered. But they underestimated something. They thought I was just a homeowner with a hobby. They didn't realize that my garden wasn't just plants in the soil, it was the heart of my freedom, the symbol of my independence. Neighbors began whispering. Some encouraged me quietly, thanking me for standing up to the board. Others avoided me, fearful that siding with me might paint a target on their own backs. And then some actively sneered, claiming the HOA was just doing their job and that I should stop being difficult. Every trip down the street felt heavier, every look from the board members sharper. But the more they tried to isolate me, the more determined I became. The final straw came in the form of a notice of legal action. The HOA claimed they had the right to forcibly remove unauthorized vegetation and would be taking steps to do so. That meant my garden, the tomatoes, the herbs, the sunflowers, everything I had built was under direct threat. The board wanted to erase it from existence. My sanctuary was about to be ripped away, not because it caused harm, but because it didn't conform to their narrow vision of uniformity. I stood in the backyard that evening, staring at the rows of plants, swaying gently in the breeze. The garden that had started as a passion project was now a battleground, and if the HOA wanted a fight, I was ready to give them one. They thought they could bury me under paperwork, drown me in fines, and intimidate me into compliance. But they had just made the biggest mistake of all. They had awakened the fighter in me, because this garden wasn't going anywhere, not without a war. When the notice of legal action arrived, something shifted inside me. The HOA had crossed a line. No longer were they issuing empty threats or sending routine violation letters. They were preparing to take my garden, the very heart of my peace, and erase it as if it had never existed. That letter was more than paper, it was a declaration of war. And in that moment, I decided I would not simply defend myself. I would fight back with everything I had. The first step was simple but critical: documentation. I walked the garden with a camera, capturing every angle, every row, every detail of what I had built. The footage showed the neatness of the beds, the order of the layout, and the undeniable fact that nothing about this garden was unkempt or dangerous. I photographed the fence surrounding it, the fact that it was invisible from the street, and the thriving plants that stood as evidence of care, not neglect. If they wanted to claim it violated community aesthetics, I would make sure anyone who saw the images understood the truth that this garden was beautiful, not an eyesore, but documentation alone wasn't enough. The HOA was notorious for twisting rules, manipulating language, and exploiting vague phrases in their covenant agreements. I had to understand what I was up against. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the thick HOA handbook laid out in front of me. Page after page was filled with rigid codes about lawn care, mailbox placement, exterior paint colors, and even acceptable holiday decorations. But as I combed through the fine print, I realized something. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere did it mention restrictions against gardens within fenced backyards. The rules spoke about front yard landscaping consistency and visible plantings from the public street, but nothing touched what was grown in private spaces shielded from view. This was my first weapon, their own rulebook. They were threatening me over something they had no authority to control. Still, I knew knowledge alone wasn't power unless it was wielded properly. That's when I turned to records. Public records, to be exact. Every HOA board is supposed to keep minutes of their meetings and decisions, and by law, homeowners are allowed access. So I filed a formal request. The board dragged their feet, of course, responding with curt messages and delays, but eventually they had no choice but to hand them over. And buried in those meeting notes, I found something that made my blood boil. Months earlier, the HOA president had specifically mentioned my property. My address was written plainly with notes that described unsanctioned gardening activity and recommendations that enforcement measures should be taken swiftly to discourage non-compliance from spreading. It wasn't just a violation in their eyes, it was a precedent they wanted to crush. They feared that if one homeowner was allowed to maintain a garden, others might follow, and the illusion of control the board cherished would begin to crack. They weren't enforcing fairness. They were enforcing power. The realization only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just defending my garden anymore. I was defending the right of every homeowner to enjoy their property without being smothered by the iron grip of arbitrary rules. The board wanted to make an example of me, but I was going to make an example of them. As the days went by, the harassment escalated. Notices turned into certified letters. The fines they claimed I owed ballooned into several $1,000s, figures designed to intimidate me into surrendering. Neighbors reported seeing board members snapping photos from behind corners, trying to catch me in supposed acts of known compliance. It was absurd, invasive, and relentless. But instead of frightening me, it only fueled my determination. I began to log every incident in a journal, times, dates, descriptions, turning their harassment into a detailed record of misconduct. Every action they took against me became another piece of evidence for my eventual case. Word of the conflict spread quietly through the community. Some neighbors avoided me entirely, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. Others whispered encouragement when no one else was around, telling me they admired my refusal to bend. A few even shared their own stories, small skirmishes they had endured with the HOA that had left them bruised but too afraid to speak out. That's when I realized this wasn't just my battle. I was standing at the front line of a war that many had lost before me, and if I could hold my ground, maybe others would find the courage to do the same. I began researching attorneys specializing in HOA disputes. The stories I uncovered were shocking. Entire families had lost their homes to foreclosure because of unpaid fines. Others had been dragged through years of litigation over petty infractions, their lives consumed by the endless grind of legal fees. But I also found victories, cases where homeowners had fought back and won, exposing boards for corruption, misuse of funds, or overreach of power. Each case study became fuel for my fire, each success a reminder that the HOA wasn't invincible. Meanwhile, the garden continued to thrive, oblivious to the storm raging around it. Tomatoes ripened on the vine, beans twisted their way up poles, and sunflowers unfurled in the late summer light. Every time I walked among the rows, I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a quiet strength reminding me why this fight mattered. It wasn't about vegetables. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about ownership, independence, and the right to live freely in the space I called home. Then came the board's boldest move yet. One afternoon, I received a letter stating that they intended to enter the property to rectify the violation within 7 days. In plain language, they were threatening to step onto my land, rip out my plants, and destroy months of work with their own hands. It was the moment they revealed just how reckless and arrogant they had become. And it was also the moment I realized the battlefield had shifted. This was no longer a war of letters and fines. This was about trespassing, destruction of property, and violations of homeowner rights. That letter became my rallying cry. I contacted an attorney the very next day, laying out every piece of evidence I had collected: the photos, the rule book, the meeting notes, the journal of harassment. For the first time since the conflict began, I felt like I wasn't standing alone. The attorney's eyes lit up at the sheer volume of misconduct, and I could tell right then that the HOA had underestimated me. They thought I would fold under pressure. Instead, I was about to turn their threats into ammunition. The board believed they were dealing with a stubborn homeowner clinging to a garden. What they didn't realize was that they had just created their own worst nightmare. A homeowner who wasn't afraid to fight back, who was ready to drag their secrets into the light, and who was prepared to transform this garden into a courtroom weapon they would never forget. The countdown had begun. 7 days until they claimed they would enter my property. 7 days until the first real clash. And I was ready. The days after that threatening letter felt heavier than any I had experienced since moving into the neighborhood. Every morning, I woke up with a sense of dread, wondering if this would be the day the HOA stormed into my backyard to destroy what I had built. Their notice had been clear. They intended to enter my property within 7 days to rectify the violation. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. And with each sunrise, the countdown in my head grew louder. But what the HOA didn't realize was that while they were preparing for their move, I was preparing for mine. I wasn't about to sit idle and wait for them to strip away months of hard work. I set up security cameras around the perimeter of my backyard, high resolution, motion activated, and linked directly to cloud storage. If they so much as placed a toe across my fence line, I would have undeniable proof. I also posted clear no trespassing signs visible from every approach. The letter may have claimed authority, but the law was on my side. And when they crossed that line, I wanted every piece of evidence I could gather. The night before the deadline, I walked through the garden in silence. The moonlight fell across the leaves of the tomato plants, the tall sunflowers swayed in the breeze, and the herbs filled the air with their earthy fragrance. It struck me then just how much this space meant to me, not just as a hobby, but as a lifeline. This garden had carried me through difficult days, given me peace when the world felt overwhelming, and reminded me of the simple joy of nurturing life. Losing it would have been more than losing plants. It would have been losing a piece of myself. And that was something I refused to let happen. On the morning of the 7th day, the air was tense. I worked from home, but I barely touched my laptop. Every sound outside made my heart skip: a car door slamming, footsteps on the pavement, the faint hum of conversation drifting down the street. Then, just before noon, I saw them. 3 HOA board members marching down the sidewalk like soldiers on patrol, clipboards in hand, their eyes locked on my property. My pulse quickened as they stopped at my gate, exchanging glances like conspirators about to commit a crime. Without hesitation, one of them reached for the latch. The cameras clicked on, capturing everything. They pushed the gate open, stepping onto my land as if they owned it. And just like that, the battle began. They walked straight toward the garden, gesturing at the beds of vegetables as though they were inspecting contraband. One of them pointed to the tomatoes, and another scribbled furiously on a clipboard. I stood inside, watching through the window, my blood boiling but my resolve steady. Every second they remained inside my yard was another nail in their coffin. Every step they took was another piece of evidence I would use against them. Eventually, one of them bent down, reaching toward a zucchini plant as if preparing to yank it from the soil. That was the breaking point. I stepped outside, my phone in hand, recording everything as I called out to make it clear they were trespassing. The moment they saw the camera aimed at them, their confidence faltered. They froze, their bravado slipping into visible discomfort. They muttered something about enforcement measures, but their tone was weaker now, less assured. They knew they had been caught. Within minutes, they retreated, leaving through the same gate they had arrogantly entered. But the damage was already done, not to my garden, but to their reputation. The footage was undeniable. The board had trespassed on private property without legal authority, and I had captured every second. That evening, I sent the footage to my attorney along with a detailed timeline of events. His response was immediate. The HOA had overstepped in a way that could cost them dearly. Trespassing, harassment, misuse of authority, it was all there, laid bare in the evidence I had collected. What they thought would be a show of power had become the very rope they would hang themselves with. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about the footage, about how the board had been caught red-handed. Some even reached out to me directly, emboldened by the fact that I had stood my ground and documented their misconduct. They shared their own frustration stories of petty fines, bullying tactics, and unfair enforcement that had left them feeling powerless for years. For the first time, the community began to see the cracks in the board's facade. The HOA wasn't some untouchable authority. They were just people who had gotten too comfortable with their own power, and now they were facing someone unwilling to bow. The board, however, doubled down. Within days, I received another letter, this one dripping with venom. They accused me of obstruction of enforcement, claiming my refusal to comply had forced them to take stronger measures. They threatened not only fines but also legal action to recover damages from their so-called wasted time. It was laughable, really. They had trespassed on my property, been caught on camera, and now they were trying to paint themselves as the victims. But this time, I wasn't rattled. I had the upper hand, and I knew it. My attorney began drafting a formal complaint, not only to dispute their claims, but also to pursue action against them for harassment and unlawful trespass. The board thought they could intimidate me into silence. Instead, they had handed me the perfect case to dismantle their authority piece by piece. As summer rolled on, the garden flourished. The tomatoes grew heavy on their vines, peppers turned brilliant shades of red and yellow, and the sunflowers towered higher than ever before. Every harvest felt like a victory, every basket of fresh produce a reminder that I was still standing strong. The HOA had tried to break me, but instead, they had hardened me. And as the days passed, something else began to grow alongside the vegetables, a movement. Quiet at first, but steadily gaining strength. Neighbors who had once been silent began to speak up, attending HOA meetings, questioning decisions, and demanding accountability. My fight had sparked something larger than myself. This was no longer about one garden. It was about the freedom of every homeowner to live without fear. of arbitrary punishment. The board, however, was not ready to surrender. Their pride was on the line, and pride is a dangerous thing when mixed with power. They called a special meeting, one they claimed would address community concerns. But everyone knew the truth. It was a desperate attempt to reassert control, to save face in front of a neighborhood that was slowly turning against them. I prepared myself for what was coming. The evidence was in my favor, the law was on my side, and the community was beginning to see the truth. But this fight was far from over. The HOA wasn't going down without a war, and I knew the next chapter would be the most brutal yet. The notice for the special HOA meeting arrived folded neatly in my mailbox, as if it were an invitation to a grand event. But it wasn't a celebration, it was a battlefield invitation dressed up in polite language. The board claimed the meeting was to address ongoing community violations and reestablish harmony within the neighborhood. Anyone who read between the lines knew exactly what it meant. This was about me. This was about the garden. And this was the board's attempt to reclaim control before the whispers spreading through the queue. Community grew into a full-blown rebellion. The days leading up to the meeting felt electric. Neighbors stopped me during walks, their voices hushed but their eyes sharp with curiosity. Some wanted to know if the rumors were true. Had the board really trespassed onto my property? Others offered quiet words of encouragement, telling me they were tired of living under the constant weight of fear, fines, and rigid conformity. I realized then that this wasn't just my story anymore. It was everyone's story, and the board's grip on the community was slipping with each passing day. On the evening of the meeting, the community hall was packed. More residents than I had ever seen gathered under one roof, their chairs forming a restless sea of folded arms and murmurs. The board members sat at the front like self-appointed royalty, clipboards stacked before them, expressions stiff and unreadable. But beneath their composed faces, I saw the flicker of unease. They knew the tide was shifting, and this meeting would either cement their authority or unravel it completely. The board opened with the usual formalities, roll calls, financial updates, the kind of monotony designed to lull an audience into compliance. But when the agenda turned to community compliance issues, the air shifted. The president leaned forward, his voice heavy with authority, painting a picture of a neighborhood under threat from unauthorized modifications. He spoke of rules and harmony, of order being disrupted by individuals who thought themselves above the law. It was clear where this was going. He never spoke my name, but every eye in the room turned toward me. When it was my turn to respond, I didn't raise my voice or lash out. Instead, I laid the facts bare. I described how the board had targeted me without cause, how they had trespassed onto my property in a blatant act of overreach, and how I had the footage to prove it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as I explained the rules written in the HOA handbook itself, rules that made no mention of banning private gardens shielded from public view. And then, as the tension thickened, I revealed the most damning evidence of all: the meeting notes I had obtained, records that showed the board had discussed my address specifically and planned to use my case as a deterrent. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and raised voices filled the hall. Residents who had been silent for years now spoke openly, demanding answers. They questioned the board about fines they themselves had received, about inconsistencies in enforcement, and about money that seemed to vanish from the HOA budget without explanation. The board, once so confident in its authority, fumbled for responses, its masks of control slipping as the community it claimed to represent turned against it. But the board wasn't about to surrender quietly. They retaliated with threats of lawsuits, warnings of escalating penalties, and even insinuations that non-compliant homeowners could face foreclosure if fines went unpaid. It was a scare tactic, meant to silence the room and reassert dominance. For a moment, the hall grew tense. Again, fear creeping back into the faces of my neighbors. But then I stood once more, holding up the letter they had sent, threatening to enter my property and destroy my garden. The words were plain, undeniable, and paired with the footage of their trespass, it was checkmate. My attorney had prepared me well. That night, I announced that I had formally filed a complaint against the board for harassment, unlawful trespass, and abuse of authority. The room went silent. For years, the board had been the predator and we the prey. But now, the Roles had shifted. The predator was cornered, and the community saw, perhaps for the first time, that the board was not untouchable. The fallout from that meeting spread quickly. Within days, neighbors began organizing, meeting in living rooms and backyards, sharing stories of unfair fines and intimidation tactics. What had started as whispers turned into a chorus, and the once feared HOA board found itself drowning in questions it couldn't answer. But even as cracks began to show in their foundation, they didn't back down. Instead, they doubled their efforts. More violation notices appeared on my doorstep, each one more absurd than the last. They cited me for excessive vegetation growth, despite my garden being meticulously maintained. They fined me for unauthorized yard ornaments, referring to the simple wooden stakes supporting my tomato vines. It was laughable, but it was also dangerous. Their goal wasn't just to punish me, it was to bury me in fines and paperwork. Until I either gave up or went broke. My attorney and I, however, were ready for this escalation. Every notice they sent was cataloged, every fine contested, every attempt at intimidation documented. We began building a case brick by brick, turning their harassment into the very evidence that would dismantle them. The legal battlefield was forming, and I was no longer the lone homeowner they thought they could crush. I was the spearhead of a movement, and behind me stood a community that was beginning to wake up. In the midst of all this chaos, my garden remained a beacon of resilience. The plants thrived, indifferent to the human conflict swirling around them. Each harvest was a reminder that no matter how many letters or threats arrived, the soil remained fertile, the sun still rose, and life continued to grow. That simple truth gave me strength. If a seed could push through the dirt, stretch toward the light and bloom despite the odds, so could I. But even as I stood tall, I knew the battle was far from over. The board was cornered, and cornered enemies are the most dangerous of all. Their pride had been wounded, their power questioned, and their control slipping. I could feel the storm building, darker and more violent than anything yet. The next strike wouldn't be subtle, it would be explosive. And when it came, I had to be ready to fight not just for my garden, but for every homeowner who had ever been crushed under the weight of an HOA's arrogance. The meeting had lit the spark. The lawsuit was the fuel. And now, the fire was spreading. The weeks following the community meeting were some of the most tense I had ever lived through. What began as whispers of discontent had grown into a full-fledged movement, neighbors stepping out of the shadows, emboldened by the fact that the board was not invincible. Yet, as the community found its voice, the HOA board grew more hostile, desperate to reassert the power they believed was theirs by right. The fines against me multiplied in a flurry of paperwork. Each envelope delivered to my mailbox was another attempt to bleed me dry. They began stacking accusations, citing me for so-called infractions that ranged from yard clutter to unauthorized modifications of the property perimeter. It was absurd. They even went so far as to list the garden's trellises and tomato stakes as violations, claiming they were unapproved structures. Every charge was another layer of intimidation, but none of them held weight under the very rules they swore to uphold. Meanwhile, my attorney and I pressed forward with the lawsuit. We weren't just disputing the fines anymore. We were pursuing damages for trespass, harassment, and abuse of authority. What the board thought would be a one-sided show of dominance had transformed into a legal war that threatened to dismantle their reign entirely. The discovery process unearthed layers of documents, financial reports, and board communications, and with each passing week, the facade of control they had projected began to crumble. The first crack came when we dug into the HOA's financial statements. At first glance, they looked normal columns of dues collected, maintenance expenses, landscaping contracts, and community event costs. But the deeper we went, the more inconsistencies appeared. Tens of thousands of dollars allocated for community improvement had no receipts attached. Landscaping fees were being billed at nearly double the market rate, all paid to a single company, one conveniently owned by the brother-in-law of the board president. And then came the most damning revelation. Unexplained withdrawals from the HOA's reserve fund, money siphoned out in chunks that added up to a staggering amount. It became clear that the garden wasn't the real issue. It never had been. The board wasn't trying to protect community aesthetics. They were trying to protect themselves, to keep homeowners distracted and compliant while they lined their pockets. My garden had been a convenient target, a distraction to make it seem as if they were keeping order, when in reality, their own hands were buried deep in the community's money. Armed with this knowledge, the narrative shifted. What had started as a petty fight over vegetables became a story of corruption and abuse of power. My attorney prepared motions that would not only defend my rights, but also expose the board's financial misconduct. The evidence was undeniable, and once it entered the courtroom, there would be no turning back, but the board didn't take this revelation lightly. They struck back with everything they had. Suddenly, I was bombarded with legal notices claiming I was responsible for defamation, accusing me of damaging their reputations within the community. They demanded retractions, apologies, and threatened even more lawsuits if I continued to speak publicly. It was intimidation in its rawest form, a desperate attempt to silence me before the truth spread any further. And yet, silence was no longer an option. Word of the financial irregularities leaked through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once been indifferent were now furious. Families who had struggled to pay their rising HOA dues demanded answers, realizing their money might have been used to fund someone's lavish lifestyle instead of improving the community. Meetings turned volatile, with homeowners shouting questions the board couldn't answer. The board's control, once so absolute, was unraveling in real time. The pressure built like a storm. On one side, the board lashed out, throwing legal threats like lightning bolts. On the other hand, the community rallied, pushing for transparency, demanding new elections, and calling for audits of the HOS accounts. And there I stood in the middle, the garden that had once been a symbol of peace, now the flagpole of a revolution, but the board wasn't finished. In a final, reckless gamble, they attempted one last strike. One evening, while I was away, someone entered my backyard. The cameras caught the entire incident: two figures, faces obscured, cutting through trellises and tearing plants from the soil. By the time I returned, several of my vegetable beds were destroyed, vines ripped from the ground, and the air heavy with the scent of crushed leaves. It was a blatant act of vandalism, and it was no coincidence. They wanted to send a message, to prove they could still take from me no matter what the law said. But what they failed to understand was that every desperate act only tightened the noose around their necks. The footage from the cameras captured not only their crime, but also their identities. Two board members themselves, caught red-handed in the act of destroying my property. When I presented that footage to my attorney, his reaction was immediate. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was criminal. The lawsuit expanded, now including charges for vandalism and destruction of property. The case that had started with a garden dispute had grown into a legal nightmare for the HOA, one that threatened not only their positions but also their personal finances and freedom. And as the garden lay damaged, something unexpected happened. Neighbors showed up at my door, carrying seedlings, tools, and offers to help rebuild. People I barely knew stood beside me, planting, watering, and restoring what the board had tried to destroy. The act of vandalism, meant to break me, had instead united the community against them even more. The board's cruelty had backfired spectacularly. The legal battlefield was set. On one side stood a corrupt board, desperate, cornered, and increasingly reckless. On the other stood a homeowner armed with evidence, supported by a community no longer afraid to fight back. The courtroom would be the final arena, and the verdict would decide more than the fate of my garden. It would decide whether power truly belonged to a few at the top or to the people who had built their lives within this community. The board had overplayed its hand. The garden was no longer just soil and plants, it was proof of their corruption, a symbol of defiance, and the cornerstone of a case that would bring them to their knees. And as the court date approached, I knew one thing with certainty. The war was about to reach its climax. The day of the trial arrived with the weight of months of struggle pressing down on my shoulders. What had started as a simple desire to grow vegetables in my backyard had spiraled into a full-scale war that consumed not only my life but also the spirit of the entire community. The courtroom felt like a stage where every grievance, every petty fine, every ounce of corruption would finally be laid bare for all to see. The board entered with the arrogance they had carried since the beginning. Their tailored suits, polished shoes, and smug expressions were meant to project confidence, but beneath the surface, I saw the cracks. They looked tired, stretched thin by the mounting pressure, and though they still clung to their facade of control, I knew they were running on fumes. They were not the untouchable authority they once pretended to be. They were just neighbors, flawed and now exposed. On my side, I had my attorney, stacks of documents, video footage, and a silent army of supporters sitting in the gallery. Dozens of homeowners from our neighborhood filled the benches, their presence alone a testament to how far this fight had reached. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there because they had been wronged too. They had paid into an HOA that had betrayed their trust, and today, they wanted justice as much as I did. The proceedings began with the board's attorney presenting their case. They framed me as a reckless homeowner who defied community rules, who refused to comply with standards everyone else respected. They spoke of uniformity, order, and how my garden threatened to devalue the neighborhood. Their words dripped with practiced authority, but the effect was hollow. The judge listened, expression neutral, yet I could sense that the story was wearing thin. Then it was our turn. My attorney rose, steady and deliberate, and began unraveling the web the board had spun. First came the financial records, those messy, incomplete documents the board had fought so hard to conceal. Each page displayed unexplained expenses, inflated contracts, and missing receipts. The courtroom buzzed as neighbors leaned in, eyes widening at the numbers they had never been allowed to see. Money meant for community improvements had been funneled into the pockets of relatives and friends. A siphoning operation disguised as governance. Next came the surveillance footage. The video of two board members, under the cover of night, ripping plants from my soil and tearing apart trellises, played on the courtroom screen. Gasps filled the air as the images spoke louder than any words could. This wasn't enforcement of rules. This was spite, pettiness, and criminal behavior laid bare. The board members squirmed in their seats, faces pale, as the undeniable evidence stripped them of their dignity. Finally, testimony from neighbors added weight to the case. Homeowners described years of harassment, arbitrary fines, and selective enforcement of rules. They spoke of fear, of feeling trapped in their own homes, and of the immense relief when someone finally stood up to the tyranny. Their voices, raw and emotional, painted a picture of an HOA that had long stopped serving the community and instead served only itself. By the time my attorney concluded, the tide was undeniable. The courtroom had shifted. What began as a dispute over a garden had transformed into a reckoning for the entire board. Their authority was shattered, their credibility gone. The judge recessed to review, and silence hung heavy in the room. When the verdict came, it was decisive. The court ruled in my favor, declaring the fines and violations against me invalid and unlawful. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for harassment and vandalism, and the board members caught in the act faced personal consequences for their crimes. But the ruling didn't stop there. The judge ordered a full audit of the HOA's finances, overseen by an independent party, and mandated new elections for the board. The iron grip that had once held our neighborhood captive was officially broken. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors cried tears of relief, some embracing in the gallery, while others whispered excitedly about what this meant for the future. For the board members, there was no celebration, only the heavy weight of defeat. Their empire of intimidation had crumbled in front of everyone they once lorded over, and there was no recovering from that. As for me, the victory was more than personal. Walking out of the courtroom, I knew the garden had been saved, but the fight had become something far greater. It wasn't just about vegetables or soil anymore. It was about standing up to power when it overstepped, about refusing to let fear silence what was right. The garden was the spark, but the fire that followed had burned away corruption and given the community back its voice. In the weeks that followed, the change was visible everywhere. The garden was rebuilt not by me alone, but by neighbors who came together to help replant, weed, and water. Each seed placed into the soil was a statement, a promise that our community would no longer be ruled by fear. The laughter of children echoed as they picked tomatoes and berries, while older residents proudly admired rows of vegetables flourishing again. What had once been a target for fines was now a centerpiece of unity. The board members resigned in disgrace, some facing further legal consequences as the financial audit uncovered even more mismanagement than we first realized. A new board was elected, composed of homeowners who valued fairness, transparency, and the actual well-being of the community. For the first time in years, HOA meetings weren't filled with tension and intimidation, but with honest discussions about improvements, budgets, and neighborly support. As for me, I often found myself standing in the garden at dusk, the warm light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the soil. The battle had been exhausting, at times overwhelming, but the sight of green life thriving where there had once been destruction reminded me why it was worth it. The garden had endured, stronger than before, and so had I. The story of my garden wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every person in that neighborhood who had found their courage, who had discovered that even against the weight of authority, the truth could prevail. And as the vegetables grew, season after season, they weren't just food. They were a symbol of resilience, justice, and the power of standing tall when everything around you tries to force you down. The HOA tried to steal my garden. Instead, they lost their power, their corruption was exposed, and the community won back its freedom. And in the quiet rustle of leaves and the steady hum of life in my backyard, I found peace, knowing the battle had been worth every moment.